Welcome to Café Tales. I'm Alie, your host for today's mystery. We're joining the legendary Hercule Poirot, today aboard a fog-bound Channel ferry in 1935, with death on the crooked ferry. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Settle in with a warm cup of tea, keep your wits about you, and let's unravel this impossible mystery together. Chapter 1. The Channel, Crossing Death on the Crooked Ferry. Chapter 1. The Channel crossing the November fog hung over Dover like a shroud as I made my way through the dampened streets toward the ferry terminal. My collar turned up against the chill. The year 1935 had brought its share of uncertainties, and this particular evening promised to add another layer of mystery to an already tumultuous time. Beside me, Hercule Poirot walked with his characteristic precision, each step measured and deliberate despite the treacherous cobblestones made slick by the persistent drizzle. "Mon ami Hastings," Poirot observed, adjusting his overcoat with a small shiver. "The Channel. She is not welcoming us this evening, Nan. Rather beastly weather for a crossing." I agreed, glancing toward the harbour where the lights of the ferry Britannia's Pride glowed dimly through the mist. "Are you quite certain this business in Calais cannot wait until morning?" Poirot's mustache twitched slightly, a sign I had learned to recognize as indicating either amusement or mild irritation. "The matter of Madame Olivier's missing jewelry. It will not resolve itself, my friend. Besides," he added, with a theatrical gesture toward the fog-shrouded vessel, "Poirot finds the atmosphere most stimulating." As we approached the gangway, the ferry's imposing bulk loomed above us, its brass fittings gleaming wetly in the harbour lights. The Britannia's Pride was no luxury liner, but she maintained a respectable dignity with her polished woodwork and well-maintained fixtures. The first-class accommodation, I had been assured, would provide adequate comfort for the brief Channel crossing. A uniformed steward greeted us at the entrance to the first-class lounger, compact but elegantly appointed room panelled in rich mahogany. "Good evening, gentlemen. I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction. The crossing should take approximately 2 hours, weather permitting." "Merci," Poirot replied, his sharp eyes already surveying the room's occupants with a systematic attention I knew so well. The lounge contained perhaps a dozen comfortable leather chairs arranged around small tables, with tall windows offering what would normally be spectacular views of the Channel. Tonight, however, the glass revealed nothing but an impenetrable wall of grey mist. A small bar occupied one corner, tended by a white-jacketed steward, while a coal fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, providing welcome warmth against the evening's chill. Our fellow passengers presented an intriguing tableau. Near the fire sat a portly gentleman of perhaps 60 years, his expensive suit and gold watch chain proclaiming his prosperity. He consulted a pocket watch with the regularity of a metronome, snapping it shut with an audible click before returning it to his waistcoat pocket every 15 minutes like clockwork. "Mr. Reginald Thornfield," the steward murmured discreetly as he showed us to our seats. "Industrial magnate, made his fortune in textiles, I believe." Across from Thornfield sat a younger man who bore a distinct resemblance to the older gentleman, though where the father's face showed satisfaction and self-importance, the son's features were marked by a sullen discontent. He nursed a whiskey, with the dedication of a man drowning his sorrows, occasionally casting resentful glances toward his companion. "Geoffrey Thornfield," I surmised quietly, and Poirot nodded almost imperceptibly. Near the windows, a woman of perhaps 35 sat with elegant composure. Her dark hair was styled in the latest fashion, and her clothing bore the unmistakable mark of Parisian couture. She held herself with the poise of one accustomed to admiration, yet there was something guarded in her manner as she observed the other passengers through half-lowered lashes. "Francaise," Poirot murmured, his trained ear catching the subtle accent as she requested tea from the passing steward. And if Poirot is not mistaken, a woman with secrets. Nan. In a corner chair sat a distinguished gentleman with the bearing of a military man, his posture erect, despite his apparent age of 60 or more. His clothes were well tailored, but not ostentatious, and he read his newspaper with the focused attention of one genuinely interested in its contents, rather than using it as a shield against conversation. "Colonel something or other, I'd wager," I whispered to Poirot. "India's service." From the look of him, the final passenger was perhaps the most unobtrusive of all, a woman of middle years, dressed in the respectable but unremarkable clothing of a governess or companion. She sat quietly with a book, her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap. Yet I noticed her eyes occasionally lifted from the pages to observe her fellow travelers with an attention that seemed almost calculating. As the ferry's engines rumbled to life, and we began our journey into the fog-shrouded channel, I settled back in my chair with a sense of anticipation. The confined space, the disparate group of passengers, the isolation imposed by the thick fogel combined to create an atmosphere that seemed pregnant with possibility. Poirot, I noticed, had positioned himself where he could observe the entire lounge, his fingers drumming silently against his armrest as he watched the interplay of glances and carefully avoided conversations among our fellow passengers. When Thornfield consulted his watch for the third time and snapped it shut with particular emphasis, Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. Most regular in his habits, that one, I observed. Mais oui, Poirot replied softly, and in Poirot's experience, it is often the most regular habits that prove most illuminating. The ferry pitched slightly as we entered the rougher waters of the channel proper, and the fog pressed against the windows like grasping fingers. In the warm glow of the lounge, with the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft clink of china, we seemed suspended between two worlds, the solid certainty of England behind us and the mysterious continent ahead, wrapped in mist and uncertainty. Little did I realize, as I accepted a brandy from the attentive steward, that this crossing would prove far more eventful than either of us had anticipated. The fog that shrouded the channel would soon conceal more than just the familiar landmarks of home and destination. It would hide the movements of a killer whose carefully laid plans would challenge even Poirot's legendary powers of deduction. Chapter 2. The Locked Door Mystery. Chapter 2. The Locked Door Mystery. The evening service had been announced for 7, and as the appointed hour approached, I found myself glancing about the first-class lounge with growing curiosity. The fog had thickened considerably since our departure, pressing against the windows like cotton wool and muffling the usual sounds of the ferry's progress through the choppy channel waters. Poirot sat beside me, his hands folded precisely over his walking stick, observing the assembled passengers with that particular intensity I had come to recognize. The Frenchwoman, Mademoiselle Dubois, as she had introduced herself to the steward, consulted a small jeweled watch and frowned delicately. Pardonnez-moi, she addressed the room generally, her accent lending a musical quality to her words. But, has anyone seen Monsieur Thornfield? The dinner, it is to be served soon. Geoffrey Thornfield looked up from his fourth whiskey of the evening, his expression sour. The old man's probably taking one of his constitutional visits, he said with undisguised irritation. Regular as Big Ben, he is, about his habits. The Colonel, who had introduced himself earlier as Colonel Whitmore, lowered his newspaper slightly. Punctual fellow. From what I've observed, he commented in crisp military tones. Consulted that watch of his at precisely 1:45. Should have returned by now, I'd say. Miss Peyton glanced up from her needlework, her pale eyes reflecting the lamplight. Perhaps the rough seas have affected him, she suggested quietly. The motion has grown rather pronounced. Indeed, the ferry had begun to pitch more noticeably as we encountered the heavier swells of the channel proper. The wind had risen, and I could hear it moaning through the rigging above. Yet Thornfield had seemed quite untroubled by the motion. During our earlier observation of his methodical perambulations, 20 minutes passed. The steward appeared in the doorway, resplendent in his white jacket, and cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ladies and gentlemen, dinner is served in the dining saloon. If you would care to follow me." "What about father?" Geoffrey asked, though his tone suggested more annoyance than concern. "Shall I fetch him?" Permits Mademoiselle Dubois rose gracefully. "Perhaps he has been taken ill. I shall inquire." She glided from the lounge with the fluid movement of a woman accustomed to drawing admiring glances. The rest of us remained seated, caught in that peculiar British reluctance to acknowledge openly that something might be amiss. Poirot's fingers drummed silently against his walking stick. "Most curious," he murmured to me. "The precise gentleman becomes imprecise. It is not in character. Nantuff." Before I could reply, Mademoiselle Dubois reappeared, her composure slightly ruffled. "The steward, he says Monsieur Thornfield has not been seen since he left the lounge," she reported, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "And the door to the lavatory, it is locked, and no one answers when we knock." A chill that had nothing to do with the November fog settled over the lounge. Colonel Whitmore folded his newspaper with military precision and stood, "Perhaps we should investigate," he suggested, his tone suggesting this was less a proposal than a command. We followed him from the lounge, our footsteps echoing hollowly in the narrow corridor. The ship's motion seemed more pronounced here, away from the stabilizing comfort of the main lounge, and I had to steady myself against the paneled walls. The first-class lavatory was located at the end of the corridor, a compact but well-appointed facility befitting the Ferry's better accommodations. A uniformed steward stood beside the door, his face creased with worry. "Begging your pardon, sir," he addressed Colonel Whitmore with the automatic deference shown to obvious authority, "but the door's been locked from the inside for nigh on half an hour now. We've knocked and called, but there's no answer." Poirot approached the door with his characteristic deliberation, his head tilted slightly as if listening for sounds beyond our hearing. He rapped sharply with his knuckles 3 precise knocks that echoed in the confined space. "Silence, silence, double quotes, mon Dieu," he murmured. Then, addressing the steward, "You have perhaps a key?" "Yes, sir, but if the gentleman has taken ill and collapsed against the door, then we must ascertain his condition," Colonel Whitmore declared briskly. "Steward, if you please." The key turned in the lock with a soft click, but the door would open only a few inches before meeting resistance. Through the narrow gap, I could see a portion of expensive trouser leg and the unmistakable glint of a gold watch chain. "Stand back," Colonel Whitmore ordered, and applied his shoulder to the door with the authority of a man accustomed to overcoming obstacles. The door gave way with a sudden jerk, and we all heard the sickening thud of a body sliding across the floor. What we discovered in that cramped space defied all rational explanation. Reginald Thornfield lay crumpled against the far wall, his expensive suit disheveled, but his gold watch chain still gleaming across his considerable waistcoat. But it was the ornate letter opener protruding from his chest that commanded our horrified attention, its elaborate handle catching the electric light. Like some grotesque decoration, the Frenchwoman gasped and pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. Geoffrey Thornfield stared at his father's body with an expression I could not quite decide if a shock. Certainly, but was there something else? Relief, perhaps. "Sacre bleu," Poirot breathed, his trained eyes already taking in the impossible scene before us, "but this it is most extraordinary." The lavatory was scarcely large enough for one person to move about comfortably. The single porthole was no larger than a dinner plate and secured firmly shut against the channel weather. There was no other exit, no place for an assailant to hide, no means of escape. Yet somehow, impossibly, Reginald Thornfield had been murdered in a room locked from the inside. Dr. Morrison, the ship's physician, appeared as if summoned by some sixth sense, his medical bag in hand and his professional demeanor intact despite the circumstances. He knelt beside the body with practiced efficiency, his examination swift but thorough. "Dead approximately 1 hour," he announced quietly, rising from his examination. "Single wound to the heart. Death would have been nearly instantaneous." Captain Dalglish arrived moments later, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the scene. His authority was absolute in this floating kingdom, and his decisions would govern our immediate fate. "Right then," he declared, his Scottish accent lending gravity to his words, "no one is to leave this vessel until we reach Dover and the authorities can investigate properly. All passengers will remain in the first-class lounge under supervision." As we filed back toward the lounge in stunned silence, I caught Poirot's eye. His expression was one of intense concentration, his mind already working on the puzzle that had been presented to us. The fog continued to press against the ferry's windows, and somewhere in its concealing embrace, a killer walked among you, a killer who had apparently committed the impossible crime of murder in a locked room. The gentle motion of the ship and the distant sound of the engines seemed to mock our predicament, carrying us inexorably toward Dover, while the solution to this baffling mystery remained as obscured as the channel waters themselves. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Fog. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Fog. First-class lounge had taken on an entirely different character since our grim discovery. Where once it had been a haven of comfortable civility, it now felt oppressive, weighted with suspicion and unspoken accusations. The fog pressed more insistently against the windows, as if seeking to penetrate our sanctuary, while the ferry continued its steady progress through the increasingly turbulent channel waters. Captain Dalglish had stationed a steward at the entrance, a precaution that seemed both necessary and deeply unsettling. We were no longer merely passengers, we were suspects in a murder investigation. confined together until the authorities at Dover could sort through the impossible circumstances of Reginald Thornfield's death. Poirot had positioned himself in a chair that commanded a view of the entire lounge, his hands folded over his walking stick in that characteristic pose I knew so well. His grey eyes moved systematically from one passenger to another, cataloguing reactions, noting gestures, filing away every detail for future consideration. "Mon ami," he announced quietly, rising from his chair with measured dignity. "Perhaps it would be wise if we were to discuss what each of us observed this evening. The captain, he has given his permission for Poirot to ask a few questions." Nan, Geoffrey Thornfield, who had been staring morosely into his whiskey glass, looked up with bloodshot eyes. "Questions," he repeated, his voice slightly slurred. "What's to question? The old man's dead murdered in a locked room. Rather speaks for itself, doesn't it?" "On the contrary," Mon ami Poirot replied gently, "it speaks of many things, but none of them simple. Perhaps you would be so kind as to tell us of your relationship with your father." A bitter laugh escaped Geoffrey's lips. "Relationship? That's rich, that is. The great Reginald Thornfield didn't have relationships. He had business arrangements and disappointments. I, unfortunately, fell into the latter category." Mademoiselle Dubois shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her gloved hands smoothing her skirt with a nervous precision. "Surely this is not the time for family disputes," she murmured, though her accent could not entirely mask the tension in her voice. "Family disputes," Geoffrey repeated with another harsh laugh. "Yes, I suppose that's what you'd call it when a father threatens to disinherit his only son over a few gambling debts. Nothing that couldn't be sorted, mind you. But the old man had his principles rigid as steel. He was about money and propriety and keeping up appearances." Colonel Whitmore cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps, young man, this is neither the time nor the place for airing such grievances, isn't it?" Geoffrey's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "When exactly would be the appropriate time, Colonel?" "After they've hanged me for his murder, because that's what you're all thinking, isn't it? The wastrel son, drowning in debt, finally snaps and kills the golden goose." Miss Peyton spoke quietly from her corner, her voice carrying an unexpected note of authority. "Your father is dead, Mr. Geoffrey. Surely some respect is warranted." "Respect?" Geoffrey turned his bloodshot gaze upon her. "That's rather rich. Coming from you, Miss Peyton. Or have you forgotten why you were dismissed from our employ so suddenly 3 years ago?" The governess's pale face flushed, but her voice remained steady. "I have forgotten nothing, Mr. Thornfield, including the reasons for my departure, which were complex." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Complex, you say? Perhaps you would care to elaborate, mademoiselle?" Miss Peyton's hands tightened in her lap, but she met Poirot's gaze directly. "I was employed by the Thornfield family as governess to Geoffrey's younger Kazuna position I held for 2 years. My dismissal came without warning or adequate explanation, though I was given to understand that certain allegations had been made regarding my conduct." "What sort of allegations?" I found myself asking, though Poirot's quick glance suggested he would have preferred to direct the questioning himself. "I was accused of theft," Miss Peyton replied quietly, her dignity intact despite the admission. "A valuable brooch belonging to Mrs. Thornfield went missing, though nothing was ever proven. And indeed, the brooch was later found in quite another location. The suspicion was deemed sufficient cause for my immediate dismissal without references. Naturally, Mademoiselle Dubois had been following this exchange with obvious discomfort, her dark eyes darting between the speakers like a cornered animal seeking escape. When Poirot's attention turned to her, she stiffened visibly. "And you, mademoiselle," he said with courteous formality, "what was the nature of your acquaintance with Monsieur Thornfield?" A flush crept up her elegant neck. "We were friends," she replied carefully. "I met Reginald in Paris several months ago. He was there on business, I believe." "Friends," Colonel Whitmore repeated with a skeptical inflection that spoke volumes about his opinion of such euphemisms. "We were friends," Mademoiselle Dubois replied with defensive sharpness, though perhaps our friendship had become somewhat strained of late. "Strained how?" Poirot inquired gently. She hesitated, then seemed to steel herself for confession. "Reginald had become ... possessive, demanding more of my time than I was prepared to give. He spoke of arrangements, permanent arrangements, that I found quite impossible to consider. He wanted to set you up as his mistress," Geoffrey interjected crudely, earning a sharp look from Colonel Whitmore. "He wanted to control me, Mademoiselle Dubois corrected with quiet dignity. But I am not a woman to be controlled by any man, no matter how wealthy or powerful. Throughout these revelations, Colonel Whitmore had remained largely silent, his military bearing intact, but his eyes troubled. When Poirot's attention finally settled upon him, he straightened imperceptibly. Colonel Poirot began "You mentioned earlier that you found Monsieur Thornfield to be a punctual gentleman. This suggests some previous acquaintance." A shadow passed across the colonel's weathered features. "We served together many years ago," he admitted reluctantly. "India during the frontier troubles. Different units, but our paths crossed on several occasions." "And what was your impression of him during that service?" Poirot pressed gently. The colonel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Thornfield was ... efficient in his duties. He had responsibility for supply, procurement, and local contracting. Arrangements always managed to fulfill his quotas, whatever the circumstances. There was something in his tone, a careful neutrality, that suggested deeper feelings held firmly. Check. Poirot evidently heard it too, for his eyes sharpened with interest. "Yet you did not seek to renew your acquaintance when you encountered him aboard this ferry." "Some acquaintances," Colonel Whitmore replied stiffly, "are better left in the past." The fog continued to swirl outside the windows, and the ferry's engines maintained their steady rhythm, carrying us ever closer to Dover and whatever resolution awaited there. But as I observed the faces around me, Geoffrey's bitter resentment, Mademoiselle Dubois's defensive vulnerability, Miss Peyton's quiet dignity tinged with old hurt, and Colonel Whitmore's carefully controlled reserve, I realized that the fog concealing the Channel waters was nothing compared to the murky depths of human motivation and long-buried secrets that Poirot would need to navigate to solve this impossible crime. Each passenger harbored grievances against the dead man. Each had opportunity during that crucial hour when Thornfield made his final, fatal journey to the lavatory. Yet the locked door remained an insurmountable puzzle, defying logic and challenging even Poirot's legendary powers of deduction. Chapter 4. The weapons tailed on were still hours away when Captain Dalglish returned to the first-class lounge, his weathered face grim with the weight of command. The fog had begun to show signs of lifting, revealing occasional glimpses of the Dover lights in the distance, but our isolation remained as complete as ever. The ferry's engines had slowed to quarter speed, and I could sense we were approaching the end of our channel crossing, though not, it seemed, the end of our ordeal. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, his Scottish burr lending authority to his words, "my crew has completed a thorough search of the vessel. I'm afraid what we've discovered raises even more questions about this tragic business." Poirot straightened in his chair, his grey eyes sharpening with interest. "You have found something of significance, mon capitaine?" "That we have," Captain Dalglish nodded gravely. "The murder weapon. It's been located." A collective intake of breath swept through the lounge. Geoffrey Thornfield, who had been dozing fitfully in his chair, jerked awake with bleary eyes. "Located," but it was he gestured vaguely in the direction of the lavatory where we had discovered his father's body. "No longer, sir," the captain replied. "One of the crew found it while securing the lifeboats for our approach to Dover, tucked under the canvas covering of the portside boat, as if someone had attempted to throw it overboard but missed their mark." Mademoiselle Dubois pressed a gloved hand to her throat. "But how is this possible?" she asked, her accent more pronounced in her distress. "The weapon, it was in Monsieur Thornfield when we discovered him." "None indeed it was," Colonel Whitmore confirmed, his military training evident in his precise recollection of details. "Ornate, handle silver, or perhaps plate with what appeared to be engraved decoration." Captain Dalglish reached into his coat and withdrew a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Is this the weapon you recall seeing?" He unwrapped the object with careful precision, revealing an elegant letter opener perhaps 8 inches in length. The blade was steel, still bearing dark stains that made my stomach turn, but it was the handle that commanded attention. Elaborately worked, silver formed intricate patterns around what appeared to be a coat of arms, and even in the lounge's electric lighting, I could make out initials engraved in flowing script. "RT," Miss Peyton read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Reginald Thornfield." "Precisement," Poirot murmured, rising from his chair to examine the weapon more closely. "But this, it presents us with a most curious problem, does it not?" "I don't follow," Geoffrey said, though his voice lacked conviction. Poirot's hands moved expressively as he spoke. "Consider, if you will, the sequence of events. The murderer strikes down Monsieur Thornfield in the locked lavatory, using what appears to be the victim's own letter opener. But then, and here is where logic begins to protest, this same murderer somehow removes the weapon from the body, exits the locked room by some impossible means, and attempts to dispose of the evidence by throwing it overboard. Impossible means, Colonel Whitmore declared firmly. I examined that lavatory myself. Single door locked from the inside. One porthole no larger than a dinner plate, and secured shut against the weather. No other exits, no place for concealment. Dr. Morrison, who had been quietly observing from the corner, cleared his throat. If I may, Captain, there's another peculiarity about the weapon. I had opportunity to observe it in situ, as it were, during my initial examination of the deceased. The angle of penetration was quite precise, directly to the hearts of either considerable anatomical knowledge or remarkable luck. Or, Poirot added thoughtfully, perhaps the killer was familiar with their victim's vulnerabilities. I found myself studying the weapon with fascination and revulsion. I say, Poirot, that's rather an elaborate piece for a letter opener, isn't it? Looks more like something one might display on a desk or mantelpiece. Exactement, Hastings. This is no common implement, but rather a piece of some significance. The workmanship it is of high quality, and the personalization suggests it held sentimental value. Poirot turned to Geoffrey. Perhaps you can enlighten us as to its provenance. Geoffrey's face had grown pale as he stared at the weapon. It was father's, of course, he said hoarsely. Presented to him years ago by some business associates in India. He was rather proud of it, kept it on his desk at home, and often carried it when traveling. Carried it, Mademoiselle Dubois questioned. But surely such a thing is not, how do you, sapractical for travel. Father was peculiar about his possessions, Geoffrey replied with bitter familiarity. Liked to have his important things where he could see them. That letter opener went everywhere with him, part of his traveling desk set, along with his fountain, pen and inkwell. Miss Peyton had been following this exchange with obvious interest. I remember that letter opener from my time in the Thornfield household, she said quietly. Mr. Thornfield was indeed quite attached to it. He used to say it brought him good fortune in business dealings. Good fortune, Colonel Whitmore repeated with what might have been irony. Rather failed him in that regard last evening, wouldn't you say? Captain Dalglish had been examining the weapon during our discussion, and now he pointed to a particular aspect of the handle. There's something else, gentlemen. The crew member who found it, sharp-eyed fellow named Jenkins, noticed that the blade had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Professional job of it too, suggesting, Poirot mused, that our murderer had time and presence of mind to clean the weapon thoroughly before disposing of it. This argues against a crime of passion, does it not? The implications of this revelation settled over the lounge like the fog outside our windows. A premeditated murder, carefully planned and methodically executed, yet accomplished under impossible circumstances. The locked room remained an insurmountable puzzle, but now we had the additional mystery of how the killer had managed to remove and dispose of the weapon. I found my attention drawn to a small leather notebook that Captain Dalglish had placed on the table beside the wrapped letter opener. What's that? I inquired. Found in the deceased's cabin, the captain replied. Appears to be some sort of appointment diary or schedule book. Rather meticulous fellow, wasn't he? Geoffrey snorted. Meticulous doesn't begin to describe it. Father kept detailed records of everything, every meeting, every meal, every ... Well, everything. Said a man who didn't control his time, couldn't control his destiny. Poirot leaned forward with obvious interest. May I examine this notebook, mon capitaine? Of course, though I confess I can make little sense of most of it. The man seems to have scheduled his life down to the quarter hour. As Poirot opened the notebook and began scanning its pages, his expression grew increasingly thoughtful. The leather binding was well worn, and the pages were filled with Thornfield's precise handwriting times, appointments, notes and observations, all meticulously recorded, Tien's Poirot murmured, pausing at a particular entry. Most interesting. Here, for this very evening, we find an appointment noted simply as settlement of old debts, scheduled for 7, I repeated, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the Channel air. But that's precisely when Monsieur Thornfield would have been making his final visit to the lavatory. Poirot's grey eyes swept the assembled passengers. It would seem, Mies Amos, that our victim knew something significant was to occur at that exact time. The ferry's engines shifted rhythm as we began our final approach to Dover, and through the gradually thinning fog, the lights of England beckoned like distant stars. But the mystery that surrounded us seemed to deepen with every revelation, each new piece of evidence, adding complexity rather than clarity to an already impossible puzzle. Chapter 5. Tides of Deception. Chapter 5. Tides of Deception. The lights of Dover had grown steadily brighter through the dissipating fog, their familiar glow a promise of solid ground and civilization after our nightmare crossing. Yet, as the ferry began its final approach to the harbour, I found myself dreading the moment we would dock. Once the authorities boarded, our little community of suspects would scatter to the winds, and with them, perhaps any hope of solving this most perplexing mystery. Poirot seemed to share my urgency, for he had abandoned his usual leisurely approach to investigation in favour of a more concentrated effort, while Captain Dalglish dealt with the practicalities of bringing his vessel safely to port. My friend had requested permission to examine Thornfield's cabine, a request that had been granted with obvious reluctance. The authorities will want everything left precisely as found, the captain had warned. Touch nothing unnecessarily, and disturb nothing at all. Naturellement, Poirot had replied with dignity. Poirot, he understands the requirements of proper procedure. I accompanied him to the cabin, a compact but well-appointed first-class accommodation that spoke of its occupant's prosperity. Thornfield's travelling case lay open on the narrow bed, its contents arranged with the same obsessive precision that had characterized the man's punctual habit, shirts folded to mathematical exactness, toiletries arranged in order of size, and a small travelling desk fitted with slots for papers, pens and correspondence. Regardez Hastings, Poirot murmured, his practiced eye taking in details that would have escaped my notice. Everything in its place, everything according to system. Yet ... double quotes. He paused, his head tilting slightly. Something is not quite right, is it not? I surveyed the cabin more carefully, trying to see what had caught his attention. The bed was rumpled, where Thornfield had evidently rested earlier in the evening. His evening clothes hung neatly in the small wardrobe. Books were stacked beside the porthole. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I'm afraid I don't see it, old man, I admitted. The travelling desk, mon ami, observed the arrangement of its contents. I looked more closely at the fitted case, fountain pen in its designated slot, crystal inkwell secured in its holder, sheets of monogrammed writing paper stacked with military precision, but where the ornate letter opener should have rested, there was only an empty impression in the velvet lining. Someone has been here, Poirot announced with quiet certainty. The letter opener has been removed, but when and by whom? A more thorough examination revealed other subtle disturbances. A book that lay face down when Thornfield would surely have marked his place with a bookmark. A slight disarray in the papers that didn't match the man's obsessive orderliness. Someone had indeed searched this cabinand with considerable care to avoid detection. Could the murderer have taken the weapon from here? I asked. But that would mean the killer had access to this cabin at some point during the evening. Poirot finished thoughtfully. Most suggestive, Nan. We returned to the lounge to find the atmosphere even more charged with tension. The proximity of Dover had heightened everyone's awareness that this floating prison would soon be exchanged for more permanent constraints. Geoffrey Thornfield was pacing nervously by the windows, while Mademoiselle Dubois sat rigidly upright, her composure maintained by obvious effort. Captain Dalglish appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be docking within the quarter hour. The Dover police will be boarding immediately, and I'm afraid you'll all be required to remain available for questioning. I've been asked to inform you that rooms have been secured at the Royal Victoria Hotel for those requiring accommodation. How perfectly dreadful, Miss Peyton murmured, though her tone suggested resignation rather than surprise. I suppose we must submit to whatever investigations the authorities deem necessary. Investigation. Colonel Whitmore pronounced the word with distaste. Good God, what a business this has become. Poor Thornfield, whatever his faults, hardly deserved such an end. Poirot had been examining the ship's passenger manifest, which Captain Dalglish had provided at his request. Now he looked up with a puzzled expression. Captain, there appears to be a discrepancy in your records. The manifest lists 7 first-class passengers for this crossing, yet we have accounted for only 6. Captain Dalglish frowned and consulted his own copy of the document. 7 passengers, you say, but that's... He ran his finger down the list. counting carefully. Good heavens, you're quite right. There's a booking here for a Miss M. Thornfield, cabin 12, but I distinctly recall that cabin remaining unoccupied. Miss M. Thornfield. Geoffrey looked up sharply from his contemplation of the Dover lights. But there's no Miss M. Thornfield. In our family, I'm father's only child, and my cousin is Master Robert Thornfield, age 14. A chill settled over the lounge that had nothing to do with the Channel air. An unknown passenger booked under the Thornfield name but never seen. A ticket purchased but apparently unused, yet marked as occupied on the manifest. When was this? Booking made, Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. Captain Dalglish consulted his records again. 3 weeks ago. Paid in full by postal order. Unusual that most of our regular passengers prefer to settle accounts directly or through their usual agents. Mademoiselle Dubois had grown noticeably pale during this exchange. Perhaps, she suggested with carefully controlled voice, this mysterious Miss Thornfield she simply failed to board. Such things happen, do they not? Indeed they do, Poirot agreed pleasantly. Yet the curious thing is that her ticket was presented at boarding. Someone used Miss M. Thornfield's passage, though we have no record of who that might have been. The implications hung in the air like the last wisps of Channel fog. Someone among our small group was not who they claimed to be. The comfortable assumptions about identity and motive that had governed our investigation suddenly seemed as insubstantial as the mist that had concealed our crossing. I found myself studying each face in the lounge with new suspicion. Geoffrey's familiar features seemed suddenly uncertain as his resemblance to his father genuine or an elaborate deception. Mademoiselle Dubois's Parisian elegance could icily mask a more sinister purpose. Even Miss Peyton's quiet respectability might conceal darker secrets than we had imagined. The photograph, I said suddenly, remembering our earlier discovery. Poirot, what about that torn photograph we found in Thornfield's cabin? For the first time since beginning his investigation, Poirot's expression showed genuine surprise. What photograph, mon ami? I found no photograph among Monsieur Thornfield's effects. But you said, I began, then stopped, realizing I must have misunderstood something from our earlier conversations. The stress of the evening was clearly affecting my recollection. Captain Dalglish was securing his papers as the Ferry's engines reduced to harbour speed. Whatever mysteries remain, ladies and gentlemen, they'll have to be resolved ashore. The harbour pilot has boarded and will be tied up within minutes. Through the lounge windows, Dover's white cliffs rose majestically. In the pre-dawn darkness, their familiar chalk faces a reassuring sight after our harrowing crossing. Yet as I watched the harbour lights grow larger and more distinct, I couldn't shake the feeling that our arrival in England would bring not resolution, but a deeper entanglement in mysteries that seemed to multiply with each revelation. The ferry shuddered gently as it made contact with the dock, and the sound of running feet on the gangway announced the arrival of the Dover police. Our floating world of suspicion and impossible crimes was about to be invaded by the methodical machinery of British justice, though whether that machinery would prove equal to the puzzle, Poirot-faced remained very much in doubt. Chapter 6. The Governess's Secret. Chapter 6. The Governess's Secret. The Dover police had boarded with the efficiency of men accustomed to dealing with cross-channel irregularities, though I suspect none had anticipated encountering a locked-room murder on what should have been a routine passenger ferry. Inspector Bradley, a competent-looking man with prematurely grey hair and the patient demeanour of someone who had seen enough of human nature to surprise him rarely, had taken charge of the investigation with quiet authority. Gentlemen, he addressed Poirot and myself as we prepared to disembark with the other passengers. Captain Dalglish has explained your unofficial involvement in this matter. I'd be grateful if you could remain available for consultation. The circumstances are, to say the least, unusual. Naturellement, Inspector Poirot replied with formal courtesy. Poirot, he is always at the service of justice. The Royal Victoria Hotel, a solid Victorian establishment overlooking the harbour, had indeed been prepared for our unusual party. We found ourselves installed in comfortable rooms on the second floor, with the understanding that none of us would be permitted to leave Dover until the investigation was complete. The morning light streaming through my bedroom windows seemed to mock the Gothic atmosphere of our situation. Yet the events of the past evening felt no less mysterious for being examined in daylight. It was approaching 11 o'clock when Poirot tapped softly on my door. "The name mon ami," he said when I admitted him. Inspector Bradley has kindly arranged for us to continue our inquiries in the hotel's private dining room. There are still questions that require answers in time. She grows short. I found the assembled passengers looking considerably more strained than they had the previous evening. The civilized veneer of shipboard acquaintance had worn thin, replaced by the stark realization that one among them was a murderer. Miss Peyton sat apart from the others, her hands folded in her lap and her pale eyes fixed on some point beyond. The window where Dover Castle stood, sentinel over the harbour. Miss Peyton Poirot began gently, settling himself across from her with the careful movements of a man conscious of his effect on others. Yesterday evening you spoke of your employment with the Thornfield family and the circumstances of your dismissal. Perhaps you would be so kind as to elaborate on those circumstances. The governess's composure, which had remained intact throughout the ordeal, finally showed signs of cracking. Her hands tightened in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tremor she could not entirely suppress. "I was falsely accused," she said quietly. "The theft of Mrs. Thornfield's emerald brooch had nothing to do with it. Yet when it disappeared from her jewelry case, suspicion fell upon me immediately." "Why you, particularly?" Inspector Bradley inquired, his pencil poised over his notebook. "Because I was convenient," Miss Peyton replied with bitter clarity. "The governess, the employee, the person without family connections or social standing. To protect her, when the brooch vanished, it was far easier to blame the hired help than to consider other possibilities." Geoffrey Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look here, Miss Patton, that business was years ago. Surely there's no point in rehashing old grievances now." "Old grievances?" Her pale eyes flashed with sudden fire. "Mr. Geoffrey, that old grievance destroyed my reputation and livelihood. Do you know what it means for a governess to be dismissed without references? I was fortunate to find employment at Orland, then only in the most modest circumstances." Poirot leaned forward, slightly, "Yet you continued to follow the Thornfield family's activities, did you not? You seemed remarkably well informed about their current circumstances." Miss Peyton's flush deepened. "One hears things," she said defensively. "Former servants talk. The Thornfield household was not discreet in its operations." "What sort of things did you hear?" Inspector Bradley pressed. She hesitated, glancing around the room at the other passengers before fixing her gaze on Poirot. "That Mr. Thornfield's business practices were not always scrupulous. That there were questions about contracts in India, about workers who had died unnecessarily, about funds that had disappeared." Colonel Whitmore stiffened visibly. "I say that's rather serious accusations to make about a dead man." "Dead men," Miss Peyton replied with quiet dignity, "cannot sue for slander." Poirot's grey eyes had sharpened with interest. "These allegations about India, were they specific? Did you hear names, dates, particular incidents?" "There was talk of a famine," Miss Peyton said slowly, as if reluctant to voice the words. "Workers on a railway project, I believe. Money that should have gone for food and supplies was diverted. People died who might have lived." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Even the sounds of Dover harbour traffic seemed muted by the weight of her words. "That's a monstrous accusation," Geoffrey said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Father may have been many things, but he wasn't a murderer, wasn't he?" Miss Peyton's voice was barely above a whisper. "How many deaths does it take before one becomes a murderer, Mr. Geoffrey? Is it only murder when one wields the knife personally?" Mademoiselle Dubois, who had been following this exchange with obvious distress, suddenly spoke. "These stories, they are terrible, but what have they to do with poor Reginald's death? The past, it cannot be changed. Nan, cannot it?" Poirot mused softly. "Yet sometimes, mademoiselle, the past has a way of demanding payment. Old debts, as Monsieur Thornfield noted in his appointment book, must sometimes be settled." Inspector Bradley cleared his throat. "Miss Peyton, I must ask you directly, did you bear sufficient grudge against Mr. Thornfield to wish him harm?" The governess met his gaze steadily. "Inspector, I despised Reginald Thornfield for what he did to me, and what I learned he had done to others. But despising someone and murdering them are quite different things. Besides," she added with a slight, bitter smile, "even if I had possessed the will to kill him, I certainly lacked the means. How does one commit murder in a locked room and then vanish like smoke?" "An excellent question," Poirot agreed. "Yet someone managed it, did they not? Someone among us found a way to accomplish the impossible." The governess's revelations had cast a new light on our mystery. painting Thornfield not as merely an unpleasant businessman, but as someone whose actions had led to genuine tragedy. Yet even as these deeper motives emerged, the central puzzle remained unsolved. The locked lavatory still defied explanation, and the identity of our mysterious seventh passenger remained unknown. As the morning progressed toward noon, I found myself studying Miss Peyton with new interest. Her quiet dignity concealed depths of anger and resentment that ran far deeper than her initial admissions had suggested. Here was a woman whose life had been destroyed by Thornfield's callousness, who had spent years in reduced circumstances while nursing her grievances. Yet, for all her motives, she remained as constrained by the physical impossibilities as the rest of us. The locked room stood like an insurmountable barrier between suspicion and proof, challenging even Poirot's legendary powers of deduction and leaving us all trapped in a maze of motivation without resolution. Chapter 7. The 15-minute solution. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across Dover Harbour when Poirot finally called for our assembly in the hotel's private dining room. Inspector Bradley had spent the morning pursuing his own lines of inquiry, interviewing crew members and examining the physical evidence with the methodical thoroughness of Scotland Yard procedure. Yet despite his efforts, the locked room murder remained as baffling as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot announced, rising from his chair with that theatrical flourish I had come to know so well. "The time has arrived for Poirot to present his solution to this most perplexing mystery." The assembled passengers straightened in their chairs with varying degrees of anxiety and anticipation. Geoffrey Thornfield, who had been consuming whiskey with steady determination since breakfast, looked up with blurry attention. Mademoiselle Dubois clutched her handkerchief with nervous fingers, while Colonel Whitmore maintained his military bearing despite the obvious strain of the past 24 hours. Miss Peyton sat with her customary quiet dignity, though I noticed her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "The murder of Reginald Thornfield," Poirot continued, "was accomplished through the exploitation of one simple fact, his obsessive punctuality. Our killer understood that certain habits, once established, become as reliable as clockwork itself." Inspector Bradley leaned forward with professional interest. "You mean the 15-minute schedule he maintained?" "Precisement," Poirot confirmed. "Mr. Thornfield visited the lavatory every quarter hour with mechanical regularity. This pattern was so established, so predictable, that our murderer could time their actions with absolute precision." "But the locked door," Geoffrey protested, his words slightly slurred. "How does knowing father's habit solve the impossible problem of the locked room?" Poirot's grey eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Ah, but you see, the locked room was never the true problem. We have been approaching this mystery from the wrong direction entirely. The question is not how the murderer entered the lavatory, it is how they left it." He moved to the window, gesturing toward the harbour, where the Britannia's Pride lay moored at the dock. "Consider the layout of that vessel's first-class accommodations. The lavatory in question was located at the end of the corridor, adjacent to the maintenance areas and crew passages. What we failed to notice in our initial examination was a second access point." "Impossible," Colonel Whitmore declared firmly. "I examined that facility myself. Single door, one porthole, no other exits, no visible exits," Poirot corrected gently. "But behind the wall panel marked maintenance authorized personnel only lies a service corridor used by the crew for repairs and cleaning. During our crossing, with the ferry pitching in heavy seas, one particular panel had worked loose from its moorings." Inspector Bradley consulted his notes. The ship's engineer did mention some minor damage to the interior fittings during the rough weather. Exactement. Poirot nodded approvingly. "Our killer discovered this loose panel by accident, perhaps through prior knowledge of the vessel's layout. It provided access to the lavatory from the maintenance corridor, bypassing the main door entirely." The implications of this revelation began to settle over the room. If there had been a second means of access, then the impossible crime became merely a matter of careful timing and execution. "But the victim would have seen his attacker," Mademoiselle Dubois objected. "Surely he would have cried out, struggled." "Not necessarily," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "Remember, Monsieur Thornfield expected to meet someone at precisely 7. His appointment book noted a settlement of old debts. He was not surprised. By his killer's appearance, he was expecting them." Miss Peyton had grown very pale during this explanation. "You're suggesting the murder was arranged in advance, that poor Mr. Thornfield met his killer by appointment?" I am suggesting, Poirot said carefully, that our victim knew something significant was to occur that evening. Whether he anticipated his own death is another matter entirely. The detective began to pace slowly around the room, his movements deliberate and measured. The sequence of events becomes clear when we understand the timing. At precisely 7:15, Monsieur Thornfield made his customary visit to the lavatory. The killer, knowing this schedule intimately, was waiting in the maintenance corridor. They entered through the loose panel, confronted their victim, and struck the fatal blow with Thornfield's own letter opener. Inspector Bradley added, consulting his notes, taken earlier from his cabin, "But here is where our murderer displayed true cunning. After the killing, they did not attempt to escape immediately. Instead, they waited for the moment when Thornfield's absence would be noticed, when his failure to return would seem natural given his rigid schedule." Geoffrey leaned forward, his face flushed with alcohol and emotion. "How long would that have been?" 15 minutes, Poirot replied simply. "Exactly 15 minutes until the next scheduled visit. During those crucial minutes, while the victim lay dead in the locked lavatory, the killer returned through the maintenance corridor, disposed of the weapon in the lifeboat, and rejoined the other passengers in the lounge. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of Dover Harbour traffic and the measured ticking of the mantelpiece clock. Each passenger sat frozen in their chair, the weight of Poirot's deduction settling over them like a physical presence. "But who?" Inspector Bradley asked quietly. Which of these people had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the motive to carry out such a plan? Poirot's gaze swept slowly across the assembled suspects, his grey eyes holding secrets that would soon be revealed. The killer required intimate knowledge of Thornfield's habits, access to his cabin to obtain the weapon, familiarity with the Ferry's layout to discover the loose panel, and above all, a motive powerful enough to justify murder. He paused beside the window, the afternoon light casting his shadow across the room like a dark promise of revelation. The killer also required something else, something we have overlooked in our focus on method and opportunity. They required the emotional strength to face their victim, to look into his eyes, and to strike the killing blow at close quarters. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Each suspect sat rigid with apprehension, knowing that the moment of final revelation was approaching. Outside, the Dover fog was beginning to roll in again, obscuring the harbour and wrapping the hotel in its concealing embraces, if nature itself sought to hide the truth that Poirot was about to unveil. Chapter 8. Justice in the Dawn. Chapter 8. Justice in the Dawn. The moment of revelation hung in the air like the Dover fog pressing against the hotel windows. Poirot stood silhouetted against the dying afternoon light, his small figure commanding the complete attention of everyone in the room. Inspector Bradley's pencil was poised over his notebook, while the assembled passengers sat frozen in anticipation of the accusation that would shatter our small community forever. "Colonel Whitmore," Poirot said quietly, turning to face the distinguished military man, "you have been very patient during these proceedings, very correct in your responses. Yet, Poirot cannot help but notice that you have been selective in your truthfulness." Colonel Whitmore's military bearing remained intact, but something flickered behind his eyes, a shadow of resignation, perhaps, or relief that the charade was finally ending. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Poirot." "Then allow me to be more specific," Poirot replied with gentle precision. "You served with Reginald Thornfield in India. This much you have admitted, but you have not told us the true nature of that service, nor the circumstances that brought you aboard the Britannia's Pride last evening." "I told you we had differences," the colonel said stiffly. "Some acquaintances are better left in the past." You did say this. But differences, this is such a mild word for what truly lay between you, is it not? Poirot moved closer, his grey eyes never leaving the colonel's face. "Shall I tell them what really happened during the Rajasthan Railway project of 1923? The colour drained from Colonel Whitmore's weathered features. "That was 12 years ago," he said hoarsely. "Ancient history. Ancient history that cost how many lives, Colonel? 50, 100, more." Poirot's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the silk. Local workers hired to lay track through difficult country promised adequate food and medical supplies, but the money allocated for those supplies had disappeared into other channels, did it not? Geoffrey Thornfield looked up sharply, his whiskied old mind struggling to process these revelations. "What are you talking about?" "Father's railway contract was one of his most successful ventures. Successful for whom? Poirot asked sadly. For your father certainly, for his shareholders without doubt, but for the workers who died of starvation and disease, while Thornfield diverted their survival funds to maximize his profits. For them, it was somewhat less successful. Colonel Whitmore's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. I tried to stop him, he said, his voice barely audible. I filed reports, sent telegrams to headquarters, pleaded with the local authorities, but Thornfield had connections, influence. My reports were buried, my concerns dismissed. Yet you never forgot, Poirot observed, even after the project ended, even after you returned to England, the memory of those deaths haunted you. And when you encountered evidence that Thornfield was planning similar efficiencies in his new ventures, I couldn't let it happen again, the colonel said with sudden force. 12 years I've carried the guilt of my failure to stop him. The first time I learned he was expanding his operations to burn using the same methods, the same criminal disregard for human life, I knew I had to act. Inspector Bradley leaned forward. How did you come to be on the same ferry as Thornfield? Surely that wasn't coincidence. A bitter smile crossed the colonel's lips. Coincidence? Hardly. I've been tracking his movements for months, gathering evidence, building a case that might finally bring him to justice. But everywhere I turned, I found the same story: influence, connections, money changing hands to ensure silence. So you decided to take justice into your own hands, Poirot stated matter-of-factly. I arranged to meet him, Colonel Whitmore admitted, his military bearing finally cracking. Sent him a letter detailing what I knew, demanding he confess or face exposure. He agreed to meet aboard the ferry. Neutral ground, he called it. Said he had a proposition that might interest me. Mademoiselle Dubois gasped softly. You were the mysterious seventh passenger, Miss M. Thornfield. Margaret, the colonel said with quiet dignity. My daughter's name was Margaret. She died 3 years ago. Consumption, brought on by the poverty we endured after I was cashiered from the service for making trouble about Thornfield's contracts. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrible clarity. The photograph, the booking under a false name, the intimate knowledge of Thornfield's habits, all of it made sense now. The meeting in the lavatory, Poirot continued relentlessly, was your idea. You knew his schedule, knew he would be vulnerable and alone. You entered through the maintenance corridor, confronting him with your evidence one final time. He laughed. Colonel Whitmore said, his voice hollow with remembered pain. Showed me the letter opener, his good luck charm, he called it. Said it had brought him fortune from India to England and would continue to do so. When I threatened him with exposure, he said he'd have me arrested for extortion. Called Margaret a bastard who got what she deserved. And so you killed him, Inspector Bradley stated quietly. I struck him down like the dog he was. The colonel replied with fierce satisfaction. Used his own weapon against him, the precious letter opener that symbolized all his bloody profits. It seemed appropriate. The 15-minute timing, I said, understanding flooding through me. You knew exactly when he would be alone, when you could strike and return unnoticed. Military precision, the colonel said with grim pride. Some habits never leave you. I waited in the maintenance corridor, struck when the moment was right, then rejoined you all in the lounge. If the fog hadn't delayed our arrival, if the authorities hadn't been so thorough, you would have escaped. Poirot finished. Perhaps, but justice, Colonel, true justice requires more than successful escape. It requires that the truth be known, that the guilty be held accountable for their crimes. Inspector Bradley rose from his chair, his duty clear despite the complexity of the case. Colonel Whitmore, I must ask you to accompany me. You'll be charged with the murder of Reginald Thornfield. The colonel stood with military bearing, his confession having lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders. I understand, Inspector. I've been prepared for this moment since I made my decision aboard that ferry. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he turned to face us one final time. Thornfield was a murderer who killed with contracts and ledger books instead of knives. The law couldn't touch him, but justice found a way. The fog had thickened outside the windows, and as Inspector Bradley led Colonel Whitmore away, the Dover harbor disappeared entirely behind its grey veil. The mystery that had begun in the Channel mist was ending the same way, with truth emerging from concealment and justice, however complex and morally ambiguous, finally being served. As I watched the dignified figure of the colonel disappear into the fog-shrouded street, I reflected on the terrible ironies of our case. a man who had killed to prevent future deaths, who had taken justice into his own hands when the law had failed him. Poirot's brilliant deduction had solved the puzzle of the locked room, but the deeper questions of right and wrong, of justice and vengeance, remained as murky as the channel waters that had carried us all toward this inevitable conclusion. Asterisk, thanks for joining us for Death on the Crooked Ferry. Did you suspect Colonel Whitmore before Poirot revealed how he exploited Thornfield's 50 routine and the loose maintenance panel? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Hercule Poirot, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, this is Alie, signing off from Café. Tales